Hello, fellow gamers, and this is the second video where we're talking about what possible game we could use and what setting for our play-by-post. The other video is about various Savage World settings. This one is going to be about two games that are designed to use Lovecraftian horror as sort of the theme of the game. So before we get started, because not everybody knows a lot about Lovecraftian horror, I just want to talk about H.P. Lovecraft's vision of horror and what that means in terms of how the universe that you play in works as a player of Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green. I'm going to quote Mike Mason, who's the lead developer of Chaosium's 7th edition Call of Cthulhu. He has three really good statements that kind of encapsulate this. He says that Lovecraft envisioned an uncaring cosmos in which, unbeknownst to humanity, strange aliens and godlike beings rule. He says that the fundamental truths of the universe are so alien and horrifying that mere exposure to them might result in madness. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the human mind is an inflexible container. It cannot hold both cosmic truth and complete sanity at the same time. And this is actually crucial, and it's probably the thing that has most drawn me to this world for using a role-playing game system, the fact that you cannot both contain the cosmic truth and sanity at the same time. If we think about what this means for player characters in a Lovecraftian horror campaign, the central premise of Lovecraft is that there are no true victories over the horrors. The player characters, therefore, are tragic figures. Their goal is to learn the cosmic truths. There are usually two outcomes. One is they fail to learn the cosmic truths, which will often lead to physical death. The other is that they succeed in learning the cosmic truths, and this leads to insanity. Thus, the end state of most player characters in a Lovecraftian horror, just as it is for the protagonists of his short stories, is either death or insanity, depending on whether you succeed or fail at learning the cosmic truths. Professor Dungeon Master, who has a great YouTube channel called Dungeon Craft, summarized it this way when he was talking about Lovecraftian horror. In a fantasy setting, the player characters are heroes. In a horror setting, they're victims. And so this is why the player characters are tragic figures. So the two games that use this world, this view of reality to build a game system are Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green. And in these games, the player characters are either investigators doing investigating on their own in Call of Cthulhu, or they are agents working for the Delta Green Black Ops agency in the Delta Green game. Each player character in these games should be driven to uncover secret knowledge, because that's the whole point of the game. If you're a character who's just going to say, I don't want to do this anymore, I walk away, that's not really relevant to the game. So everybody should make a PC that is driven to uncover secret knowledge, and this is what maintains the tragedy, because you can't stop. Something is forcing them to keep uncovering the knowledge, even though going forward leads to madness. The bulk of the gameplay in Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green is research and investigation. You will explore secret or hidden places, solve strange, unusual murders, look into odd disappearances, read forbidden books of lore, and oppose dark and mysterious cults. In both games and in Delta Green, you do all of that while trying to prevent the public from learning anything about those things, because the agency knows that way lies madness. There are several Lovecraftian settings that we can use. The classical Lovecraftian setting is in the 1920s, which is what the bulk of 7th edition Call of Cthulhu is designed around, although you can do present day with Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. They tell you how to do that. It's just not where most of their adventures are aimed. The majority of people who try to do modern day Call of Cthulhu instead use Delta Green. This is a spin-off of Call of Cthulhu. It works mechanically in a very similar way, but you're an agent rather than investigator, and it has slightly different and slightly simplified rules. A lot of people actually recommend starting with Delta Green when you're getting into Call of Cthulhu, just because some of the rules are a little bit simplified. There's also historical Call of Cthulhu. They've got a number of source books for playing it in other time periods. The only one I own is Cthulhu Dark Ages. And this is one that would kind of hybridize fantasy with Call of Cthulhu because it's set in like the 800s AD, early 900s of Great Britain. And there's a whole wealth of fun, cool things you can do in this book. So if people are interested in doing a little medieval times plus a little horror, this would be a potential setting. Although I think probably the easiest of the three is Delta Green. Call of Cthulhu 1920s would be the second easiest. Dark Ages is a little more complicated, but I feel like in a play-by-post where we're doing it a little bit at a time, it would be more digestible and easier to do. Okay, so the basic gameplay, and by the way, all of these pictures I'm showing are artist renditions of Lovecraftian horrors to give you a sense of what these things are like. The basic gameplay is using the D100, the 100-sided dice, the D10 and the D1, the 10s and the 1s to roll percentile dice and resolve actions. Almost everything is done based on percents. You have characteristics such as strength, constitution, dexterity, intelligence in both games. You have secondary attributes. They're slightly different in each game, but both games have hit points and sanity and luck. Call of Cthulhu has magic points. Delta Green has willpower. They serve similar functions. There are dozens of possible occupations, and each one gives you certain bonuses to skill checks and things like that. And there's a long list of skills that take values of from 0 to technically 99, because you can't have a skill over 99. To succeed, you simply roll the value or lower. So if you have a 50 skill, you just roll 50 or lower and you succeed, 51 and above and you fail. That's sort of the basic way to do it, but then each game tweaks that a little bit. So I want to show you how the character sheets work because that will help you understand what these games are like. We're going to start with Call of Cthulhu. This is a 1920s Call of Cthulhu character sheet. The only difference with the modern times is they add things like computer science and stuff to it, which you wouldn't have in the 1920s. At the top, we have the 8 characteristics: strength, constitution, size, dexterity, appearance, education, intelligence, and power. And these are fairly self-explanatory. We can get into it if you guys choose this as the game. To the left, you have hit points that can go from whatever your max is down to 0. Once you're at 0, you're either dying or unconscious. It mostly depends on the type of blow. If I punch you when you go to 0 hit points, you're unconscious. If I shoot you with a bullet or stab you with a sword, you're probably dying. Then we have sanity, which can go from 99 to insane. At 0, you go completely and irrevocably insane. Luck, which can go from 99 down to 0, which is out of luck. And then magic points, which are used for things like rituals. The bulk of the character sheet shows the many, many skills, any one of which you can raise and lower, and you decide which skills you want. As you can see, this character, Emma Marsh, who's an example, has a few skills, and there are several numbers here, and I'll talk about what that means. To succeed at anything, you roll under the stat or under the skill. That number or below is a success. So let's take a look at library use over here. There are 3 numbers, 70, 35, and 14. This character has a 70 skill in library use. To make a check, you roll D100, and there are different levels of success in Call of Cthulhu. A critical success is a 1. So if you roll an 01, it's a critical success. If you roll 1/5 or lower of your stat, you get an extreme success. So the 14 is 1/5 of 70. So if you make a skill check on library use and you roll a 14 or an 11 or a 7, you get an extreme success. It's a very successful check. If you get half the value or lower, it's a hard success. And if you equal or below the value, it's a success. So the way this works is you can do this 2 ways. I could say to you, make a roll against a hard success. What you're asking to do is hard, so you need a hard success. That means you have to roll a 35 or below. I may just say it requires a success, then a 69 would succeed, right? But if I say you need a hard success and you roll a 69, that's a failure. That's the way some groups play it. Other groups, and I think the way we would play it for play-by-post, and this is why I'm explaining this so you can envision it, is I would simply say make a roll, and you would roll it, and you would tell me in the post, I got a hard success. And then I would know whether a hard success was enough or not. If my notes say this requires an extreme success, then a hard success would be a failure. If you go over the value. If you roll higher, it's a failure. And if you roll a 96 to 00, it's a critical failure, similar to a critical failure in Savage Worlds. Something bad will happen. You break the lock picks in the lock or what have you. You can spend luck points permanently to help make a roll. So if you need a 35 and you roll a 40, you can spend 5 luck points and drop your luck, say in this case from 75 to 70, to change the roll 5 points and succeed. However, those points are permanently spent. There are ways to slowly get points, but they're very hard to do and it doesn't happen quickly. And sometimes you will be asked to make a luck roll. So if you spend a bunch of points and you get down to 10 luck and then I ask you to make a luck roll, you're probably not going to succeed. Failing a sanity roll, where you roll against your sanity, this character's is a 50 for example, causes a loss of sanity. How much depends on the horror you're facing. If you lose 5 or more points at once, you can go temporarily insane. And if you ever go down to 0 sanity, the character is lost to madness. And it means it's time to roll up a new player character. Succeeding at a skill marks it. There's a little checkbox next to the name of each skill. You check it off when you succeed at it. And at the end of a chapter or an adventure, you can make a roll to see if it improves. And that's how your character gets better. Delta Green is a similar layout, but obviously it looks like it's more modern because it's supposed to be like a personnel file, and the stats and stuff are a little bit different. At the left, the statistics are strength, constitution, dexterity, intelligence, power, and charisma. So they use charisma instead of appearance, and they do the scores a little bit differently. But we'll worry about that if we decide to play this game. Below that, we have the derived attributes. Hit points and sanity are the same, but there's willpower, which has to do with sort of whether you can endure the insanity, and the breaking point. When you get to a breaking point, you get a permanent disorder for your character's psychology. There's also something called bonds. This is a very cool feature that we will talk about in a little bit. But to begin with, as a character, you name your bonds. This could be with a small group, like I'm bonded to the faculty of my department in the biology department, or an individual person, my best friend, my wife, my ex-husband, my nephew, my golfing buddy, my neighbor, my boss, my assistant, my graduate student, whatever. Bonds can be damaged over time, and that's what the checkboxes are for. And then at the bottom we have the skills, and it's set up very much the same as Call of Cthulhu with checkboxes next to it, except the checkboxes work a little differently, and that sort of thing. Again, like Call of Cthulhu, you roll under the stat, but the level of success is simplified. They only have critical successes, which are if you roll well enough, you get a critical success. We'll talk about what that means if we play this game. A regular success is just rolling under the stat. A failure, which is rolling too high. And then a crit fail, when you roll above the stat in a certain way, it's a critical fail, much like critical successes and failures in other games. Failing a sanity roll causes a loss of sanity, much like Call of Cthulhu, except the bonds can help here. In between missions, your characters have home life, and during the home life, you can blow off steam with one of your bonded NPCs or groups to recover sanity. What this means, in a sense, is that you're projecting your issues onto your loved ones or your friends or your colleagues, and that can help you recover sanity, but it weakens the bond. And if the bond has a score, if it ever goes down to 0, you then break with that individual. So if you've got a bond with your wife and the bond goes to 0, you get a divorce and that sort of thing. So the idea here is that you stay sane by projecting your stresses onto other people, and that can help you avoid insanity temporarily for a little while, but eventually all of your relationships decay from what you're going through, and eventually you end up by yourself, isolated, and then your descent into insanity has no stopping point. So eventually you go insane, but you have a little longer in Delta Green than in Call of Cthulhu because you have the buffer of the bonds. Unlike Call of Cthulhu, where succeeding at a skill marks it, in this game, failing at a skill marks it, and then at the end of a session, you can roll to see if it improves. So that's one issue with Delta Green, because we don't have sessions. That that could potentially make it hard to figure out how to do this, but we can come up with something. So let's look at the pros and cons of doing Lovecraftian horror. There are a number of pros. One of them, just mechanically, is that the core gameplay loop is very simple. Even combat in, I think, both games, you only take one action in a round. And if you can abort to a defense, but then that's your action in the round. So you don't get the reactions, the bonus actions, multi actions. You can't do any of that. It's much more simplified in combat. So the core gameplay is very simple. You're just rolling under a percent every time. There's a reduced number of call and response elements compared to Suede. You want to do something, you say, I'm going to try to do spot hidden, and I got a hard success, and then I can tell you what that means. Right. Whereas I don't have to give you bonuses. I don't have to give you penalties. You don't have to, re-rolling with bennies. Most of that doesn't really happen in Call of Cthulhu, so there's less need to wait for the response of the GM before resolving your action. There's an increased emphasis on roleplay and investigation, which I think makes this ideal for play-by-post because of the de-emphasis on combat and the increased emphasis on roleplay. There's the downtime where you're trying to deal with your bonds and everything. None of that is combat or even skill checks. It's mostly just role-playing. And also there are lots of evocative descriptions that are quite lengthy in the adventures and that I would probably write about horrors, such as trying to describe this thing in the picture here. It would be very difficult to do in a live game, making these evocative descriptions while everybody's listening, but you can make a paragraph post and people can read it at their convenience, so I think it would be perfect for play-by-post. On the other hand, cosmic horror with tragic player characters whose fates are either death or insanity is not necessarily for everyone. People might not enjoy role-playing their decaying relationship with their bonds and stuff. It might hit a little too close to home depending on what types of bonds you've chosen, and so it's not really necessarily for everyone. Because of this, there's a higher potential for sort of those X cards, the red flags, the no-go topics that we don't want to get into that could arise in a game like this because it is so sort of gloomy and depressing. On the other hand, because we're doing play-by-post, we can probably stop it pretty early, yet there is a pretty high potential for that, so that's a con. It could be hard to relate to the non-modern settings, but obviously that wouldn't be true if it's in a modern setting. If it's 1920s, it might be a little awkward. And ultimately, it's an unfamiliar game system. There's going to be a learning curve. I'm going to screw it up because I've never game mastered or even played in these games. I have some knowledge of, having read the books, but I haven't played them. So there's probably going to be a bunch of bumps, and there will be a learning curve to Lovecraftian horror. And then finally for Delta Green, but not for Call of Cthulhu, there is a session-based skill advancement, so we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that, much like the session-based elements of Savage Worlds. So that's my explanation of how Lovecraftian horror would work in play-by-post. Hopefully you've watched the other video and now you have some sense of the 5 possible options, right? Delta Green, Call of Cthulhu, Savage Worlds ETU, Savage Worlds Holler, or Savage Harn, and you can come up with what you think your favorites are and go ahead and post them in the Discord and we can talk about it and see which ones we want to do.